I'm like looking at him like,
Yeah, sure.
You're right.
This is built the last 10 years.
Is that right?
all right.
Oh.
Well, we're gonna get you really fired up now. That was nothing. So we're gonna start. You're gonna hear more from Mike Calvert this afternoon about the budget, but I'm just gonna touch really, really briefly because it's relevant to the tax discussion. Then we're gonna dig in a little bit more about Nebraska's tax basics. We're gonna look at how we compare to other states, and then we're gonna talk about the major tax proposals from this session and what we can expect next year.
You got that printed? Does it pass out?
No, it is not a handout. You will have access. We will send you the slides afterwards.
Okay.
All of the slides today you'll receive later. So in terms of, this is our general fund budget. This is the discretionary part of the budget. So when revenues are down like they have been for the last few years, the legislature is looking here. Where are we going to make cuts? And you can see here, as Elizabeth told you in the last presentation, education makes up 45% of the state's general fund budget. Health and Human Services makes up another 37%. Then you have public safety and law enforcement at 11%. So combined, those three areas make up 93% of the general fund budget. And as you heard from Doug, cutting public safety is kind of off the table right now. So the areas we can look at are education or health and human services. The general fund budget is about $4.5 billion. And so what we've seen is that general fund appropriations have declined over time as a share of the economy. As you know, every year it costs a little bit more to do the same. Salaries go up, healthcare costs go up, just the cost of paper and everything else. But as a share of the economy, we have seen general fund appropriations have declined, which is then contributing to the issue that we have with funding TIOSA. And you can see here the top line here is K-12 funding. So you can see here, it starts out at about $16. It starts out at about $16 at the beginning of FY 2000, now at about $12.87, again, as a share of the economy. And K-12 education has actually had the most significant declines. You can see the university is the green line, starts out at 10 and then ends up at 754. So that's where most of the reductions have come, is in education, funding for education. The blue line is health and human services. That's non-Medicaid. You can actually see will come out a little bit higher than where we started in this slide. And then Medicaid and CHIP is the maroon, also coming up higher. Some of that is due to federal requirements that we have, but costs have increased there slightly. Public safety, you see a little bump at the end where we've been grappling with challenges in our correction system. So in terms of state aid, you saw the slide that Elizabeth showed you last time that showed you the state's commitment to funding K-12 is at a low point. This is also, we've seen pretty significant declines in state support for counties and cities as well. During the Great Recession, we actually eliminated the state aid categories. So again, as localities are looking to fund their services, if they're receiving less state aid, how are they going to make it up? And we're going to have that in just a second. And what we've seen too as a share of the economy, their spending's flat. So they're not spending more as property values have gone up. Their spending is staying very even. But there's this direct relationship that we see. We call this the mirror chart. When state support goes down, then local funding goes up and vice versa. So where we come out of this is state support for localities has gone down, spending has stayed flat, we've become more reliant on property taxes as a result. So counties, you can see at the beginning of FY01, 30% of funding for counties was coming from property taxes. Now it's 41.5. Schools has increased from 44.8 to 49.4, and municipalities have almost doubled. 10.5% of their revenue was coming from property taxes. Now it's at, or in FY 15-16, which is the most recent data we have, at 18%. So you can see our reliance on property taxes and has grown from 28.7% to 39.9% in FY 15-16. I would expect If you looked at today's dollars, that number is going to be even a little bit higher. So in terms of major taxes in Nebraska, this is what we sort of call our three-legged stool. A lot of talk about three-legged stool, property, sales, and income. We do have a fourth other stool leg that's a little bit, that's short. But property taxes are the biggest part of this pie. The longest leg of the stool, you can see that of all state and local revenue, 37.5% is coming from property taxes. The next biggest category is sales taxes, which makes up 28.9%, followed by income at 27%. And then that other leg is 6.6%. Now, a lot of talk about balancing the three-legged stool, so we want to put that in perspective for you. If we wanted to balance the three-legged stool, we would have to raise sales taxes by $200 million. We would have to raise income taxes by $400 million, and we would have to use that $600 million in new revenue to reduce property taxes. So it's a $600 million fix to have a balanced three-legged stool. So in terms of property taxes, this is the average tax rate in the state is $1.65 per $100 of taxable value. You can see here that the majority of that is coming from school districts, followed by cities and then counties, and then there's a pretty big dip for other taxing subdivisions. So most of that is going to school, and a lot of that's going through the TOC contract. So this is not going to surprise this room, although maybe Senator Rigby, what we saw here, the reason we actually took a look at what people were paying in highly agricultural areas versus high residential areas, there was a comment, it was actually former Senator Landis, said it in an Urban Affairs hearing a few years ago, that urban residents were subsidizing rural residents, and then sort of took that back and said, well, maybe that's how it used to be. That's how it used to be. Maybe it's not the case anymore. And so we took a look, and guess what? It was true that there was a time when urban residents were paying more in combined property and income taxes prior to 2008. 2008 comes, and urban and agriculture look very similar. They're about the same. And since this time, we've seen taxes grow, particularly property taxes grow significantly in agricultural areas. And so the reason we looked at income and property tax combined, sometimes we hear Act doesn't pay income tax, so we wanted to make sure to include that measure. Sales tax is difficult because people often buy, spend money on things that are outside where they live. So we focus on income and property, and you can see here that the areas that are most heavily ag land are paying significantly more in combined income and property taxes than those in more urban areas. But property tax is not just an issue for ag alone. Property tax is the largest tax for Nebraska businesses. So you can see Nebraska's businesses pay almost twice as much in property tax as they do in sales, and pay almost 3 times as much in property taxes as they do in income taxes. And if you look at this a different way on this pie chart, you can see that property tax, that businesses will pay about 45% of taxes in property, 22% in sales, and 16% income. So property tax is the largest tax, not just for ag, but for business, all businesses. So in terms of, I'm going to go to income taxes now, and we'll have more time for dialogue later. These are our income tax rates. So our bottom rate is 2.46%. We do have a progressive income tax in that the rate goes up as the income goes up. Some states have a flat tax. Ours is progressive. And I want to make sure that I point out that for someone, that top rate is 6.84%. Sometimes you'll hear people saying, you know, if someone's making $60,000, they're paying the 6.84% rate, but they're only paying the 6.84% rate on what's over income over $59,660. So they're only paying that top rate at that $340 on the $340. So I just want to make sure that you all understand that that's how that income taxes work in Nebraska. And 6.84% is our top rate on income over the amounts that are listed here. So the Department of Revenue is required by statute to do a tax burden study every few years. And in that tax burden study, they take a look at what a hypothetical $100 million cut in sales tax would yield in economic activity, and what $100 million, did I say income? What 100 million income, 100 million in sales. And they compare the two. And they find that neither tax cut, neither $100 million in tax cuts makes anywhere close enough to pay for itself in increased economic activity. They do find, I will note, that cutting the sales tax would have a higher economic impact, but neither one come anywhere close to paying for themselves. But what they have in the tax burden study as well are the marginal tax rates. So what we looked at in the last slide were the marginal tax rates. These are the effective tax rates. These are the rates that people are actually paying. So for 70% of Nebraskans, instead of that 6.84%, their effective tax rate, what they're paying on all of their income combined, is 1.73%. That's what 70% on average are paying an effective tax rate of 1.73%. Then your 8th decile, they're paying 3.16. 9th decile, which would be that top 90%, or the 10% at the 90th, are paying 3.81%. And then your 10% of your wealthiest families in Nebraska pay a 4.91% effective tax rate. So we hear a lot about our marginal rate of 6.84%, but even our wealthiest 10% are paying an average effective tax rate of 4.91%. And then they took a look at the wealthiest 500 tax returns. Their effective tax rate actually drops to 4.08%. The Department of Revenue surmises that that's due to our incentive programs, that a lot of people in that top 500 are having their tax liability dropped due to our tax incentive programs.
You're talking about just state income tax.
State, yeah. So a lot of talk, there have been a lot of bills since OpenSky has been around that would cut that top income tax rate, that 6.84%. This is just an example of a top rate cut from 6.84% to 5.99%. And the distribution, you can see, because that income tax is progressive, that higher income earners get a much bigger share of that tax cut than lower income earners. No matter what you're cutting that top rate to, anytime you cut the top rate, it's going to look the same. It's going to have the same distributional effect. So we're just using that as an example because we've seen income tax cuts proposed almost every year since we've been around. In terms of the sales tax, our state sales tax rate is 5.5%, and then local governments have 2%. They can levy an additional 2%. 229 local jurisdictions use this local option. When you scan, most of them are using it at the, they're adding a cent or a cent and a half. Those are the most common categories. Over 90% of cities are utilizing that local option in some respect. Could be a half cent, could be the full 2 cents. So what do we tax? We tax goods. So in 1967, when the sales tax was implemented, what we did was we taxed all goods, but we didn't tax services. Obviously, our economy was a lot different in 1967. Harder to also apply sales tax to a service because people didn't have, handheld credit card machines and things like that at that time. And so the only services we taxed are those that are actually added to statute. So all goods are taxed unless it's exempt from statute, and no services are taxed unless they're added. So that means what's not taxed, a lot of services aren't taxed. We did remove the tax on groceries, I think in the 80s, and we try to avoid taxing business inputs. So if you think about the chair that you're sitting on, you don't want to tax the plastic that went into creation or manufacturing of that chair because you want to tax it at the time of sale. So you don't, if you tax business inputs and you create pyramiding and lots of taxes on taxes, so you want to exempt business inputs and just tax the product at the time of final sale. Nebraska taxes 77 out of 168 services that are taxed in at least one other state. The Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy estimates that we're losing about $178 million in revenue due to untaxed consumer services. We are also losing revenue from not taxing internet sales. Hopefully the Supreme Court will be resolving this issue here, that we expect a decision on the Wayfair case in June, which would clear up as to whether states can be taxing internet sales and hopefully give some structure around that. But we're currently losing between 30, the legislature estimates $30 to $45 million in revenue loss. GAO put out a report earlier this year that at the high end estimated $97 million revenue loss for Nebraska. So there's a big range there. Amazon is voluntarily collecting sales tax on items that they sell directly. They're not collecting sales tax on items that are sold by a third-party vendor that are using the Amazon platform. So we are collecting some revenue from Amazon, but not quite as much as you would think. Then a quarter-cent of the sales tax has been diverted to roads since 2013. That was LB 84. And that reduces the amount of revenue that's going to the general fund about $74 million per year. So then that also is money that's not available for K-12 education or other things in that pie chart that used to be available. So when we talk about what our tax code should look like and how, if we should rely more heavily on income or sales or that sort of thing, you'll often hear people say income tax is very volatile, and that is true. It is more volatile. That's the solid blue line is the volatility of the income tax, but it does grow faster than the sales tax. And it particularly grows faster as we're coming out of recessions. The sales tax, you can see there, that's that red solid line, is much more stable, but it does grow more slowly. A lot of that is because we're not taxing a lot of those services and internet sales. So you see it grow more slowly, but you can also see that they respond very differently during different economic situations. So having both an income tax and a sales tax provides more stability in terms of revenue for the state than if we just had one or the other. So here's where you can see that our sales tax is growing more slowly, really because of services. And I think you could probably add internet sales here as well. But what's happening is we're spending more and more of our household income on services that are going untaxed and less of our income on our typical sales tax base. And you see that too as our population ages. And you're going to hear from David later this afternoon about demographic changes. But as folks get older and are in retirement, probably not buying refrigerators and new stoves and as many bigger ticket items. And so you do see demographic changes there in addition to just our sales tax base in general. So there's a lot of discussion at the legislature about tax expenditures. Senator Kathy Campbell's in the back here. You're going to hear from her at our panel. She was on the Tax Modernization Committee in 2013. A lot of focus, a lot of discussion at the legislature at that time around tax expenditures. This continues to be kind of a tough nut to crack, but a tax expenditure is an exemption, a deduction, a credit, exclusion, or other deviation from the normal tax structure. And so what happens is they act as spending, but they're reducing revenue through our tax code. So for example, we don't tax swimming pool cleaning. So that's that's revenue that we have sort of opted to give up. But sometimes we actually put these into place, like an exemption for zoos, sales taxes on zoos. And so once that's passed, that's reducing the amount of revenue coming into the state, and they essentially go on autopilot. They're not reviewed. There's no requirement to review them. Contrary to actual spending through the tax code, that's reviewed by the Appropriations Committee. There's hearings. There's a lot of discussion about spending, but these tax expenditures can become very costly to the state, and they lack transparency because they're not reviewed again. So a lot of services fall in this category. Internet sales There's a special capital gains election that was passed in 1987 that says if you own stock in your employer's business, you have a one-time exclusion. You can sell that stock and you do not pay state income tax on the gains. That was passed in 1987 as part of the LB 775 package when we were trying to keep ConAgra here, but there's no requirement to review that to see if we still want to be losing the $20 to $30 million a year that costs us. Is that still a policy that we should be promoting today? Tax incentive programs, I'm going to talk a little bit more about, and then business inputs would be an example of a tax expenditure, but a tax expenditure that's there for a specific and good policy purpose, trying to avoid the pyramiding of taxation. So the Department of Revenue puts out a tax expenditure report. It's published by each October 15th, and then it is presented to the Revenue and Appropriations Committees before December 1st. It will estimate the amount of revenue lost annually due to each exemption. And I would tell you that the estimates reflect a number of assumptions and vary in their reliability. So it's very helpful. You can't directly look at it as a menu of revenue raisers, but it is helpful to see what's going on taxed and can kind of give you an idea of things that the state has opted not to tax and can look and see, is that still public policy that we should be having on the books today? So it is a really, really great resource. So we also have a tax incentive report. And this report is published every July 15th and presented to the Revenue and Appropriations Committees before September 1st. In 2013, so prior to 2013, Senator Harms is chair of the Performance Audit Committee, and the Performance Audit Committee really started to look more closely at tax incentives. And a 2013 report was the first report that was released. They found that jobs created under Nebraska Advantage, which is Nebraska's biggest tax incentive program, cost the state about $42,000 to $234,000 per job. So that's how much the state was spending to create a job. And the salaries we were paying were $22,000 to $55,000 per job. So obviously that was a big concern to the legislature. And so they've continued to look more closely at our state's tax incentive programs. LB 538 in 2015 established a process to review the state tax incentive programs every 3 years. We have had a lot of problem with data collection. And so the state has been, the legislature has spent a lot of time trying to make sure, passing agreements through Department of Revenue and the legislature about sharing of information, sharing of confidential information. And they've taken a number of steps to have access to better information. In 2017, they found that the required range for wages, for the Advantage Act are about 42% less than the statewide average. And they still found that it's not enough data is collected for a useful evaluation of the program. So in 2018, with LB 936, they were able to pass a statute that allowed them to collect some more data in hopes that they can improve the analysis that they're able to do. There has been a lot of talk about incentives, and Nebraska Advantage does sunset in 2020. So next session, I think you're going to see a lot of talk about the incentive programs, how much we should be spending on them, what they should look like, that sort of thing. So more to come on that. I will mention in 2016, we had a huge spike in the cost of our incentive programs, $360 million we spent in 2016. And again, as I mentioned, it's a tax expenditure, right? So it doesn't go through the appropriations process. So when we're having this huge budget shortfall, there's no opportunity for us to say, look, we want to spend that $360 million in K-12 education. No, it's committed. And so we're committed to paying those dollars regardless of what's going on with the state budget.
Renee?
Yeah.
Who makes that decision?
Well, so what happens is the way Nebraska Advantage is set up is if you meet certain criteria, then you're eligible. There's no discretion. The Department of Revenue doesn't have any discretion. If a business meets certain...
So basically the Department of Economic Development gets to call the shots on that.
Well, the legislature has put in statute the criteria for getting incentives under Nebraska Advantage. If those criteria are met, then the incentive is automatically granted based on the criteria set out in statute. So it's the legislature. And then the Department of Revenue reviews it, says, have they met these criteria? If they have, then they sign a contract with the business. The business says that we will do these things. If they don't do all those things, then they can claw back incentives that have been paid. But really it's all set out in statute. The Department of Revenue does not have much discretion, but they sign a contractual agreement with the business. And once we sign that contractual agreement, we're locked in, which is why the Department of Revenue projects that the incentives, the Nebraska Advantage program will cost us $1 billion. I think we'll have $1 billion in obligation by like 2025, I think. So there will be a lot of discussion. And I don't think that the chambers love Nebraska Advantage either. It's not very strategic for our current economy. So we hear a lot that we're a high tax state, but we tend to rank in the middle. So this is looking at census data. I will point out that if you look at it per capita, share of personal income or share of GDP, you see a big range, right? 21st to 43rd in state and local taxes. But we do tend to hover about in the middle. Same with state and local spending. Same with individual income tax, corporate income tax, just slightly higher. Sales tax, again, hovers around the middle. Property tax ranks the highest, at 10th to 12%. When we're looking at tax codes too, we look at, is a tax code regressive? Is it progressive? Regressive means that lower income families pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than higher income families do. We do have a regressive tax code. This is not unusual. Most states have a regressive tax code, and when we look at how we look compared to other states, we're kind of right in the middle. But that light blue bar, you can see about the lowest income families pay about 11% of their income in taxes, whereas the wealthiest 1% pay a little bit over 6%. And then when you look at the red, green, and blue bars within those light blue bars, you can see that sales tax is the most progressive. Property taxes are regressive on the ends and proportional in the middle, and the income tax then is progressive, and that's the one progressive tax that we have. When you look at how we compare to other states and other, looking at business climate, quality of life, we rank very, very high. Number one for economic development from the Site Selection Governor's Cup, second year in a row. Fourth best state for business according to Forbes. Lots of really high rankings in terms of business climate. The state has taken a number of steps to have a strong ranking in business climate. Quality of life, we rank very, very high as well. High quality education, any sort of education ranking, we tend to rank very, very high. And it's a low cost place to live. So we rank really high in these measures as well. Tax Foundation would rank us 13th to 40th on taxes. So one other area where we do quite well is growth in our economy. Our economy is small, but compared to other states, has grown pretty quickly. So we ranked second in this period from 2008 to 2017 at 14% GDP growth. I have highlighted in yellow the income tax states. Sometimes you'll hear the national rhetoric that you have to cut income taxes to grow your economy, which is what Kansas tried to do, what Oklahoma tried to do, and both had to backtrack from. But the states in yellow don't have an income tax. So you can see here that there's no correlation between having an income tax, no income tax, or a high income tax and economic growth. So we've got some revenue challenges. As I said, the legislature the last couple of years has been doing a lot of budget cutting. Obviously, you're very familiar, ag commodity prices have declined, so that's certainly a challenge. The former speaker had the Legislative Fiscal Office look at all the tax cuts that have passed since 2006, and those were reducing revenue by over $800 million in FY17 alone. Most of those would have been in the income and sales tax side. Tax incentives, as I mentioned, cost us $360 million in 2016. We talked about base issues. There's also going to be a lot of unpredictability about how the federal tax changes are going to impact our state revenue, particularly as you see businesses change from being incorporated as a S Corp or an LLC to a C Corp. That will automatically have an effect on our state's revenue in a way that the Department of Revenue has no way to project at this time. Rockefeller Institute thinks it's going to be pretty bumpy. Revenue is going to be pretty bumpy and unpredictable for the next couple of years because of the federal tax cuts. We also have really dipped into our cash reserve these last couple of years in the budget cuts. Recommended levels would be 16%, and we had this going into the Great Recession. We had this going in to 2 years ago. Now we've taken it down to 6%. So if revenues continue to be bumpy, we're not going to have much of a cash reserve left to tap into. So in 2018, just briefly, there were 3 approaches to tax reform. A lot of talk about tax reform, and there were 3 sort of camps. One camp was the camp that wanted a mix of income taxes and property taxes, didn't want to raise any other revenue. And so what they did was they had a bill that would phase tax cuts in over time, relying on future revenue growth, assuming estimates of over 6% revenue growth in the future, which we think is overly optimistic. So it would not have been revenue neutral, but if we didn't have that revenue growth, then we would have had to make more cuts or raise other taxes. The second camp was focused on immediate and significant property tax relief by raising sales taxes, cigarette taxes, closing sales and income tax loopholes and exemptions. It was revenue neutral. It would have been a tax shift. This is what a lot of ag has said is there has been a tax shift. We are trying to shift it back. Then the third camp and the ballot initiative that was being talked about but has been abandoned had significant property tax relief immediately that wasn't paid for. So a lot of opposition, a lot of concern by the governor and chambers and others that it would have created a $1.2 billion hole for that $4.5 billion general fund budget. So none of these camps were able to come together to compromise on legislation. So we ended the 2018 legislative session without any addressing of property taxes. I will tell you that there has been a lot of talk from current legislators that are working together over the interim, trying to come to consensus prior to the legislative session, so that when they come in 2019, there is a plan that has been largely agreed to at the beginning of session. It would be introduced very early hearing in hopes that we could actually move something through. That group that's meeting right now is a mix of Republicans and Democrats, urban and Republican senators. So the hope is that we can find some common ground and really use the interim to do that heavy lifting. Likely tax proposals, I would expect we would see income tax rate reductions come back, property tax reductions, reducing the taxable value of agricultural land from 75% to 65% or lower. Some sort of property tax cap might be introduced earlier. Income earning capability versus market valuation has come up before, could come back again. And putting money on the property tax credit program, that has been sort of our go-to the last few years because it's simple. And tax reform is complicated. Tax incentive reform, as I mentioned, will be a big topic of debate in 2019. I think you'll continue to hear conversations about eliminating sales tax exemptions. Some discussion about private scholarship tax credits was a hot topic this session, and possibly increasing the cigarette tax. We rank in the 40s on our cigarette tax, very low. So here are some resources for you. I'm not going to go through all these. If you're interested in looking at agricultural land and how it's valued, I would encourage you to look at that second report where the property valuation changes, but primarily this report from 2014 sort of lays out what the various options would be for the legislature in terms of how we value agricultural land. So again, you'll have these slides so you can look at these reports later. So with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions. Soaking it in. I expected like lots of questions, and
You did a great job.
thank you. I appreciate that. I covered everything, so you don't have any questions left? Yes.
Have you taken any position that when I talk to some people, they say, well, we have to look at new sources of revenue, which are like legalizing marijuana or expanding gambling, which, in my opinion, are both pretty regressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything's going to be on the table. You know, Nebraska is such a late adopter of things. I don't see legalizing marijuana happening anytime soon at all. Gambling, obviously, the governor has already come out in opposition to expanded gambling, despite after the Supreme Court decision. So that may be a non-starter as well. I would guess someone would introduce a bill. But I think what you're going to be looking at, I think that the big focus will be cigarette taxes, which I will say polls really well, and people are supportive of raising cigarette taxes. I think a lot of talk about getting rid of a lot of the exemptions and taking a look at the holes that we have in our sales tax base. Ideally, you want your base to be broad and your rate to be low. So I think a lot more conversation around exemptions, a lot of conversation around incentives. Should we be spending $360 million a year to create jobs that pay between $22,000 and $55,000, especially when unemployment is so low, and the jobs that are being created under Nebraska Advantage are not necessarily high-paying jobs, even though that was sort of the intent. So I think there will be a pretty robust conversation, sort of everything on the table.
One of the advantages of Nebraska being a little slower is that we're the most favorable state when it comes to opioid addictions.
In a good way or a bad way?
In a good way. No, we're in a good way.
Okay.
It hasn't hit here like it
Got
has.
it. Okay.
in other states. We're still stuck in meth.
Well. Any other questions? Anyone remotely? I expected this really robust conversation. I've never had such a quiet group before after that. Maybe I
We thought you were
out
going
of
to
you.
have a miracle answer.
What's that?
We thought you were going to have a miracle answer.
Well, yeah, and there isn't. There is not an easy answer. I will tell you the tax modernization study, and you could certainly ask Senator Campbell more about that from 2013. The number one recommendation was to reduce property taxes by increasing funding for K-12 education. And you saw Elizabeth's slide earlier. We have done the opposite since that report came out. But it's tough. It is not easy, and it will require consensus, because right now we've got people in their camps. We did work with the Nebraskans United group who worked on putting together the bill that Senator Breezy brought, which was that second camp, that second approach, significant property tax relief in a way that was a tax shift.
They originally had higher income taxes for a certain income level, and that was removed, wasn't it? 1084.
No, it wasn't. I don't think it was removed.
Okay.
There were some tweaks. There were several amendments that were filed to it. This S Corp LLC exclusion became a sticky point. So we are the only state in the country that has, for S Corps and LLCs, if they have revenue that's non-Nebraska revenue, they don't pay state income tax on it, even if it's not taxed in another state. So according to the tax expenditure report, that reduces revenue by about $84 million. The chambers of commerce went nuts. It is a very, very lucrative loophole for very wealthy people. If you look at the tax expenditure report, they show that the majority of that loophole goes to families making more than $5 million a year. So some very, very wealthy people get very anxious about closing that loophole. And so I think that's probably what you're referring to.
And the chamber went nuts because they did not want.
They didn't want to lose the exclusion.
It's almost half the state senators.
How much money would that generate, Renee?
Because
The tax expenditure report listed it as a revenue loss of $84 million.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Have you got a head count yet on your proposal that you're talking about to introduce in 19?
So there have been conversations. So what the Nebraskans United group, and it's a group of ag and education. And we just are helping them with data analysis. We're not like an official member, but the conversations have been going back. Okay, let's look at LB 1084. What worked, what got pushed back, let's clean the bill up, and then we'll start talking to senators. And again, as I mentioned, there's a group of senators that are meeting with various groups that want to bring the three camps together to try to find some consensus. And so I think Nebraska United will be meeting with those senators probably in June.
One of the challenges goes along with that, there is no current chairman of the revenue committee.
And Revenue Committee will have at least 5 new members out of 8 next year. Yeah, it's really high learning curve and challenging, very serious subject with a lot of new faces. So that will be a challenge for sure in terms of the tax reform discussion. Unless there is a bill that's pretty much agreed to going on in session, I think it will be very hard to find consensus kind of once everyone's in the thick of things. So term limits is good and bad, right? You're all here because of term limits, but it also, you know, Senator Shoemaker we work with very closely, and in his second to last year, he's like, I'm just finally figuring this out, and now I just have 1 session left. So it's tough, but we are here to help you. So please, utilize our resources before the campaign, and once you're elected, you know, we'd be happy to sit down and help you with proposals and all sorts of things like that. So I think we're gonna grab lunch, and then we'll come back and hear from current and former senators about what they wish they would have known